Story 1. The Lonely Man. It was late spring of 2013. I was a month shy of 20 and spending another slow night with my cousin Sam, who was 2 years older. We lived in a quiet rural town in eastern Tennessee, where nightlife was non-existent. If you wanted to stay entertained past 10 p.m., you were on your own. Sam and I had a tradition of late-night drives through the back roads, talking about everything and nothing, usually winding up on some forgotten dirt road or barely there trail, pushing the limits of where our old pickup could take us. That night, we started off at the local diner for burgers and milkshakes, killing time until the streets were practically deserted. As the clock ticked past midnight, we decided to head out to one of the old winding roads on the outskirts of town. We turned onto Jackson Road, a gravel path I'd only driven twice before, always in the daylight. The road ran along the base of a densely forested hill, with old trees leaning so close, their branches seemed to scrape against the truck. On either side, the underbrush was thick and unyielding, making the road feel more like a tunnel than an open pathway. About a mile down, Jackson Road turned into an old dirt trail, barely wide enough for one vehicle. We were barely doing 10 miles an hour, but every shadow felt like it was stretching towards us, encroaching on our sense of safety. A few minutes later, as we rounded a curve, we noticed an old farmhouse off to the left, barely visible through a gap in the trees. Its windows were dark, except for a faint yellow glow coming from the attic window. Sam and I exchanged glances, but neither of us said anything. Houses like these weren't uncommon here, abandoned or left to slowly decay. But something about this place felt wrong. It wasn't just the darkness or the isolation. There was a heavy stillness around it. Sam mumbled something about the haunted vibe of the place, trying to break the tension with a laugh, but it didn't stick. We pushed on, leaving the farmhouse behind, though I felt a persistent urge to keep checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. As we continued down the trail, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees so dense they almost formed a solid wall on either side. The only sound was the low rumble of the truck's engine and the crunching of gravel beneath its tires. We came upon a section of the road where the trees thinned out slightly, revealing the side of a cliff. For a moment, the view opened up to a moonlit valley below, vast and silver in the soft light. We slowed to take it in, but then something in the headlights caught our attention. There was a figure standing in the middle of the road, about 100 feet ahead. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe a coyote, but as we inched closer, it became clear this was a person, hunched over with their head down, their shoulders draped in some kind of dark, oversized coat. The figure was deathly still, arms hanging limply by their sides. "Who the hell would be out here this late?" Sam muttered. As we got closer, the figure slowly raised its head, revealing a gaunt, hollow-eyed face. It was a man, probably in his 60s, with thin, scraggly hair that fell in oily strands around his face. His clothes were filthy, covered in what looked like mud, and maybe something darker. He locked eyes with us, staring in a way that was neither curious nor startled, just watching, like we were something he'd been expecting. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Without a word, I pressed on the gas, picking up speed to hurry and make our way around the creepy figure. As we passed him, he kept his gaze on us, his head turning slowly to follow the truck as it moved past. He made no other movements, didn't raise his hand or call out, just watched. When he was finally out of sight, Sam let out a shaky laugh, trying to mask the unease settling in. Maybe he's just lost, probably just some old hermit. But neither of us believed that. As we turned onto Black Ridge Road, a paved route that connected back to town, I felt the tension ease. But then, just as we were settling back, I saw something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. The man was standing in the middle of the road behind us, backlit by the moon, barely visible in the dust we'd kicked up. He was closer than he should have been, as if he'd been following us the entire time. We hit the edge of town in record time, not slowing until we reached the brightly lit intersection near the gas station. Sam broke the silence first, muttering about getting home and locking every door. A few days later, Sam and I were out with some people, recounting the story. Some of them laughed it off as a prank, others shook their heads, But one older guy, a local who'd been around forever, listened in silence. After a pause, he told us that Jackson Road was once home to a man known to be a recluse, rarely seen by anyone, and rumored to be dangerous. Some said he'd gone mad after his family died. Others claimed he'd been involved in strange practices, but whatever the truth, he was known as the Lonely Man. Stories circulated for years about people seeing him at night, wandering the back roads, watching. I haven't driven down Jackson Road since. Every now and then, Sam brings it up, but we both agree that some roads are better left unexplored, especially at night. Story 2. The Red Van. I hadn't planned on being out late, but I'd offered to drive a friend home after a long evening at a work event. He'd had a little too much to drink, and I thought it prudent to make sure he got home safely. The event was held in a small, tucked-away town miles from where I lived, and by the time I dropped him off, midnight had come and gone. Now, I was making my way back, following the quickest route my GPS suggested. It was supposed to save me time, but instead, it led me down desolate back roads, far from any landmarks or streetlights. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping to see something familiar, a gas station, a house, any sign of life. But there was nothing. I had been driving for so long that I started losing focus. As I drove, I saw a van parked on the side of the road. Its dark red color blended almost seamlessly with the shadows, and it seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The van was old, with dents and scratches across its side. It had one flat tire, which was strange enough, but what struck me more was how it seemed abandoned, as though it hadn't moved in years. As I passed, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone was inside, watching me. The hair on my arms rose, and a sense of unease settled in my stomach. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a van left by someone who'd had car trouble. Maybe they'd walked to get help, and the van had been here ever since. But as I continued down the road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, unable to shake the image of that abandoned van from my mind. It wasn't until I rounded a sharp bend that I noticed the faint glow of headlights far behind me. My heart skipped. There was no way that van could be moving, not with that flat tire. But there it was, a set of headlights trailing me. I told myself it was just another car, maybe someone else trying to find their way home. Yet, something about the lights seemed different. They were too dim, almost like they were trying to stay hidden. I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to keep a safe distance, but the road was narrow and winding, so I couldn't go as fast as I wanted. The headlights grew closer. When I glanced back, they flashed for a moment, as though someone had flicked their high beams on to make sure I knew they were there. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I told myself to stay calm, but the air in the car felt thin, like I couldn't get enough oxygen. My hands were sweating, slipping against the wheel, and the corners of my vision felt blurred. I tried to focus on the road, but every second or two, I would glance back, and the lights would be closer, never straying too far. Whoever was behind me, they were deliberately keeping pace. I reached a fork in the road, an old crooked sign pointing left to a small town I didn't recognize. My gut told me to go left, so I did, hoping to lose the headlights on a different route. The road here was rougher, with potholes and patches of loose gravel, and I struggled to keep control. I glanced back, and for a moment, it looked like the vehicle was gone. Relief washed over me, and I exhaled, my body relaxing just slightly. But then I looked back, and there it was again. The red van, its headlights flickering slightly, almost as if they were taunting me. It moved in quickly, and I could soon make out the shape of the vehicle more clearly in the rearview mirror. The van's front grille was mangled, and the windows were dark, completely opaque, as if someone had painted over them. My hands were trembling as I tried to think of a way out. I knew I couldn't keep driving like this forever. I needed to stop somewhere, find someone who could help. But as far as I could see, there were no houses, no towns, just more empty road winding into the distance. I felt trapped, with no choice but to keep going, hoping the van would eventually disappear. The van stayed behind me, its headlights sometimes dimming, sometimes flickering back to full brightness, like it was playing games with me. At one point, it got so close that I could see scratches across the hood and something dark smeared across the bumper. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the van slowed down, drifting farther and farther back until its headlights were just pinpricks of light in the distance. I wanted to believe it was over, that the driver had finally given up, but I couldn't relax. Not yet. I took the first side road I found, hoping it would lead me somewhere safe. By this time, I had completely lost focus on my GPS and had no idea where I was or where I was going. I refocused and drove for what felt like hours, my hands shaking and my mind racing. When I finally got home, the first thing I did was check that all the doors were locked, double and triple checking each one. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring into the dim light, replaying everything that had just happened. Had I imagined the whole unnerving experience? How had that van managed to follow me so closely? It definitely had a flat tire, didn't it? Why did it suddenly slow down and then vanish altogether? I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. It was, without a doubt, one of the most chilling experiences I'd ever been through. It was an experience that I hope to never go through ever again. Story 3. Good Samaritan. This was back in 2019, just before the world turned upside down with the pandemic. When I left work, it was usually very late at night. It wasn't unusual to drive home without seeing another soul in sight. I'd take the same route each time, winding through country back roads for about 12 miles, and I usually enjoyed the solitude. One night, I clocked out a bit later than usual. I was exhausted, my feet aching, and my only thought was about slipping into bed as soon as I got home. I'd driven about halfway when I noticed something in the distance, dim flashing lights up ahead, pulsing faintly in the dark. As I drew closer, I saw a car stopped on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking. Next to it, a man stood waving his arms in broad sweeps, signaling for help. It wasn't like me to stop for strangers at night, but he looked genuinely desperate. His car door was open, and his face was illuminated briefly by my headlights as I slowed down. He looked young, maybe early 20s, and as I rolled down my window, I could see he was visibly distressed. "Hey man," he called out, his voice laced with anxiety. "My car died on me and I don't have a phone. Could I borrow yours real quick to call for help?" I hesitated, but he looked harmless enough, and I was tired. I figured one quick call couldn't hurt, so I handed him my phone after unlocking it. He thanked me and walked a few paces away to make his call, his voice muffled as he spoke into the phone. I leaned back in my seat, half closing my eyes, figuring this would only take a minute or two. After a minute, though, I started to get this gnawing feeling that something was off. The man's car door was still open, and he kept walking farther and farther away. Feeling uneasy, I called out to him, hoping he'd turn around and start making his way back, but he didn't. He just kept mumbling and walking off into the darkness. "Hey buddy," I called out. "I gotta get going." But the man ignored me and just kept walking off into the distance. Feeling extremely uneasy now, I exited my vehicle, hoping to approach the man and retrieve my phone. A few steps away from my vehicle, I felt something move behind me. Before I could even process it, someone grabbed my shoulders, jerking me back with a strength that made me stumble. I spun around to face my attacker, a kid, maybe 17 or 18, with a wild look in his eyes and a grin that sent a chill straight down my spine. It took me a second to realize he had a knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the dim light. "Get in the back seat," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet somehow more menacing than if he'd yelled. His eyes flickered to the car where the other man was still pretending to make a call, though now he'd stopped talking and was watching me intently. A rush of adrenaline kicked in, and I knew I had only one shot to get out of there. I threw myself forward, ducking under the kid's grip and sprinting back to my own car. He shouted, a high-pitched, frustrated sound, but I didn't look back. I jumped in and slammed it shut just as the man with my phone started running toward me. In my panic, I slammed the gas pedal too hard, making the tires screech as I sped away. The last image I caught in my rearview mirror was of both men standing there, staring after me with frustrated expressions. I drove like a madman, my heart pounding, and I didn't slow down until I reached my driveway. My hands shook so badly that I struggled to unlock the front door. Once inside, I collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing over what had just happened. Only after I'd calmed down did I realize my phone was still with the stranger. With little hope of getting it back, I went to the police station and filed a report. The officer told me they'd send someone out to check the area. The next day, an officer came to my door holding my phone. "We found it out there on the ground," he said. "You might want to check to see if they accessed anything." To my surprise, nothing appeared to be accessed, and no calls had been made. It seemed they were more interested in whatever they'd wanted from me than in the phone itself. The men were never found, and to be honest, I never got the impression that the officers had any interest in pursuing the case. It's been over 4 years since that night, and I haven't experienced anything like it since. It was a hard lesson, one I won't forget. If I ever see someone stranded on the side of the road again, I'll keep driving, no matter how desperate they look. Some things just aren't worth the risk.